Well, thank you, all of you, for being here. Welcome. My name is Christina Coliandro, and I work with Imago Theater, and I'm the director of Eco Anxiety, the digital series that you're all a part of. And I am currently in Chichage, Montreal, Canada, and I am a white woman. I identify as a woman. I have glasses on. I have brown hair with white in it. And yes, and so welcome to the space. I'm very thrilled to have this conversation with you and talk to you all about your work and your thoughts and your visions on everything, what's happening, and your practices. So if everyone could go around and introduce themselves as well, please. Caddy Dad, would you like to start? You're my first window there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't know which order we were going in. Hi, I'm Caddy Dad Switch. I am calling in from New York City, the land of the Lenape people. I am a playwright and theater maker, and I identify as a white cis woman. I have brown hair. I have glasses. I'm wearing a black top and a chunky silver necklace and headphones that are red. And it's lovely to be here.
Eddie?
Hi, my name is Eddie van Wyk, or otherwise known as Kamali on Philip Babur. I'm calling in from the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation territories in so-called Vancouver, BC. And yeah, I'm a theater artist that dabbles in most of the performance elements of that, including music, dancing, acting, choreography. I have very, very short hair that I recently cut off, and I'm wearing, it has some silver, and I'm wearing a small black toque that fits my head quite well. I've got big brown eyes, and I'm a person of color. And I'm wearing a very bright pink button-up shirt with a white background, and I've got silver rings and very badly done blue, periwinkle blue nail polish on my fingers. Thank you.
Thank you. Fiona?
Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with you. Like Eddie, I'm also joining from the unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations in East Vancouver, now known as East Vancouver. And I'm a marine biologist and a conservationist, and I study the marine life along British Columbia's coast and look at how it's responding to climate change. So I have more of a science background, but I did a lot of theater in my earlier life. So I love the interweaving of art and science. And I am a white cis woman. Right now, today, I have my hair braided in 2 braids. I have dangly white earrings, and I'm wearing a white and black striped shirt. And I have, for Zoom, a virtual background of a picture that I took on a remote island in British Columbia called Calvert Island. And it has like seaweed draped on wood. It's kind of like a curtain.
Beautiful, thank you. Hannah, please.
Hi, my name is Hannah Cormick, and I am a white cis woman with dark hair, and I am wearing silver splints on my fingers. I have a kind of very green linen sheet behind me because I'm lying horizontally on my bed in my safe room, which rests on Ngunnawal country in Australia. And I am a performance artist with a background in a lot of physical forms of theatre and performance. And my work kind of looks at the intersections of climate activism and crip activism.
Thank you, everyone. Beautiful. So I'll just start us off, since this is a talkback in the context of our digital festival of eco-anxiety. So I think we can go in all sorts of different directions, but I'll start us off with a bit of a conversation around, you know, the vocabulary we use in the arts and sciences as well to speak about climate change, to access our audiences and our people. And what's fascinating to me is, because we know of all these psychological barriers that we experience as humans with climate change, how do we best use our art and our science to I would say to push ideas, to push progressive ideas forward, and to help people understand the actions that are needed at this time and place too. So yeah, I would love to hear from you in terms of how do you, as artists and scientists, see the best use of these two in order to help people understand climate change in general? I would also consider all of you eco poets too, and I'd love to hear about your thoughts on eco poetry, and even Fiona, the writing on your project House Sound, which we'll talk about too. The setup of all of that writing is beautiful and has its poetry. So you know, poetry does have a place in science too. So I don't know who would like to kind of, you know, jump in first and speak about how their practice, how you use eco poetry in your practice, and how you see your practice using also that vocabulary to transfer all of these ideas to our audiences and people in general.
I'll go. I've sort of, right now I'm studying sustainable development through Simon Fraser University, and it's been really enriching to sort of go through all of the material that is present in all of our courses. And one document that I had to read was around talking about Western scientific or Western sustainability sciences and Indigenous sustainability science. And it compares the strengths and weaknesses between those two approaches, and inevitably leans towards an approach that's from Indigenous sustainability science, which speaks to, you know, this idea of sacred. And the example it uses is from Hawaiian Indigenous theory around, you know, everything around us is made from something, has vitality and mana inside of it. And so for me, I really try, especially these days, to approach my work around what is sacred. And I need to know what is sacred to me, first of all. I always need to find it through my own body, through my own experience, through my own lived experiences, and how I engage in relationship to all of the things that I find personally sacred, and that are sacred in terms of, you know, my habitat, my ecosystem, the ecology that I exist inside of. And so things like ritual are important to me. What I do when I enter a new work or process, and who I'm entering the new work or the process with, and what I do at the end of such a process, and whether we can engage in some form of a healing practice or a practice that involves more of an awareness of the ecosystem or the ecology that we reside inside of. And so that's something that I've been really playing with, and it's been very fulfilling and deepening. In terms of eco poetry, it's again this idea of the sacred. I had one of my poetry classes in my undergrad. The teacher was so like blatantly was saying, you know, we don't really have a reason for poetry, you know, and yet we're still doing it. It's one of those things. It's part of the human, it's like part of our hearts, and part of what keeps us alive is this type of storytelling, this type of connection to something, and writing about it through our hearts and our experience of it. And for me, eco poetry does that thing to me. Is I look at the world and I can interpret it, and I can almost speak from a time in ancient past of how people would experience the world. I can almost start seeing the world old as it is, it is old. And I can almost start seeing it in that way. And I think it just helps me enrich my experience, which then activates me to create the change and to activate other people and activate spaces where I am. I think for me, a big part of how I work is to be the example when I enter a space and not expect anybody else to be doing it first. I will initiate from the get-go. I'm not going to stop myself because I just think we do have very limited time.
Absolutely, thank you.
I have a thought that kind of builds upon that. So in my work as a scientist, I study climate change, I study all of these trends and all of this data. But I think a lot of people would agree that science has failed to effectively translate that knowledge in a meaningful way that's catalyzing change as fast as we need to make that happen. And I think that there's been a big shift and change within the scientific community over the last few years in acknowledging that fact, that it hasn't worked to just rely on this information as is. We need to be communicating this research in a way that effectively touches people, that moves their hearts, that connects with where they're coming from, and that, it's just, we need to be speaking through a different way. So bringing science and art together can, I think, really help with that storytelling and really help with that motivation of making people feel moved by this information and understand it within their own worldview and within their own context. So I think storytelling and poetry and visual arts and movies and theater and dancing and song, these are all incredible mechanisms. Mechanism is kind of a weird word to use maybe, but they're critical in connecting people to this, what's happening to our Earth. And I think science needs to a lot of scientists need to really understand that. I also think that a lot of scientists are trained to be objective and to be kind of distant and removed from the information that they're working on. And that's not really great, because then that's just removing them from the people who they're trying to connect with. And so that's another change that I'm seeing, or that not just me, but it's happening in science, and I hope it happens faster, where scientists really embrace their personality, acknowledge their positionality, who they are and the worldview that they're working from, and bring their emotions more into their research, because it's emotional stuff. A lot of us are doing this because we're motivated by similar to artists, I'm sure, anxiety and despair at what's happening in the world. But scientists are often taught to not show that because they have to be unbiased. So that's something that I see in my world, and that I'm really I like the fact that it's changing a little bit, but I want it to change faster.
It's good to hear that it is changing, though. Again, with projects, this is that question of through our individual projects, how do we see these changes happening? Nothing's going as fast as any of us would like it to go, but what are those changes that we concretely see in people's reactions to things and thought processes that are changing, in these paradigm shifts? We're artists, we're scientists, I think, because we are committed to paradigm shifts and towards better ways of living together and a better world. Did anyone else want to respond?
Yeah, I'll just say that I think when faced with the subject of climate change, which is enormous, and has been with us for a long time, but I agree with Fiona. I think there has been a disconnect, especially in terms of storytelling, maybe about specifically thinking about theater right now, because I think poetry has actually done a good job in many ways, but of drawing, of making the topic not seem like despairing. Do you know what I mean? I feel like when I was working on a project with actually a marine biologist who works in Antarctica, and and I was making a play inspired by interviews with him, and he said, I want people to be moved by the work that we do, but also what we're seeing. And what I feel often is that people get lists of, facts and numbers, but there's no emotional connection to that. So, and he also said, I'm tired of seeing disaster narratives. So, I mean, the world is dying and it's dystopian and we're all doomed. And he said, that doesn't activate anyone. That actually sends people into more despair. So what are positive ways that we can, to use that word for a second, what are positive ways that we can, through our storytelling, affect change? But also one of them is to actually, make work that what I call touches the nerves and touches the soul. But there's also, I think, because the subject is so huge and it impacts every aspect of our lives on a small scale. So I'm just going to bring this back down for a second to talk about when I'm sort of working on a project, even when I'm negotiating a contract. I'm pretty specific, and I have become more so about that the means of production needs to be eco-conscious. Because I feel there's nothing worse, I think, than having a piece of art that is, speaking to climate change and climate grief and all those things, and then making it with like everything possible that goes against that in terms of the means of production. I just find that, but then what message are you sending? Do you know what I mean? And so, and I, most recently when I was working on a project, and I was putting that language into the contract, and artistic producer and I sat down, and he said, you mean every aspect of the production? I said, yes. I mean, like costumes, sets, how is the ticketing going to be handled? Like every single aspect of the production, you'd have to be thinking about how it's eco-conscious. And then, I expected pushback, because it was pretty demanding of me, I suppose. But instead, I found that the producer was, first of all, he said, oh, no one's ever asked that before. And he said, but actually, that speaks to my values, and that speaks to something we should be doing. So I feel like on a very small level, that seems like a tiny thing because it's just one show, you know what I mean? But actually, what happens if everybody did that? Even just on that level, there would be some progress. Obviously, the bigger problems with this huge topic is that there are global organizations and structures that profit from the destruction of the planet. And so it's really, the real change also needs to happen at that level. And until that happens, then I feel like our job is incremental, and maybe just pointing at things and raising awareness. But I feel like that's the massive job that needs to occur.
That's great. It's that too is a question I was talking with my artistic director, and we were talking about obsession and getting obsessed about things, because obsession almost pushes you to change or to want to change. And so how do we get people to a place of obsession through art about environment and about social issues that we need to look at, which also are very much encompassed and have been encompassed in natural resources since the beginning of our exploitation of them. But I think that's great in terms of there's definitely all the political changes that need to happen. But if people understand that the oil companies also own the cleanup companies, this very, when I learned that, I just it's all of this information that we learn as we go further on our journey that makes us angrier and makes us, and is that often our role in because I agree, like the doom narrative does not work. Obviously it does not work. And that's all we're often fed. So where is our position as artists to, in a way, not necessarily anger, but to provoke or to touch that nerve in order to push people forward?
I'm not sure if I'm going to be adding to what you're saying, but it is really related. One of the things that really breaks my heart about what we're experiencing globally is this. Yeah, it's making me a little bit emotional, but this thing that our imagination is co-opted and our attention is making other people money, and we like, you know, this screen is using things to make my brain addicted to it, you know, on all of these different platforms. And if you look at the stats, the tech companies are the 5 highest GDP, and their GDP grew last year, like big time. So for me, it's just heartbreaking to think of adults whose imaginations are not being activated, and whose imaginations, you know, people just think, yeah, artists are creative. I'm not creative. I'm not an artist. I'm not creative. And I'm like, what? You just made this amazing meal, and then you put this beautiful sheet on the table, and you put the roses, and you put the plates. That's completely creative and completely artistic. What do you mean you're not an artist? What do you mean you're not creative? And to me, that's like one of the things that I kind of, for me, I'm my activist part of me is like, I want to go and get adults to be in their imaginations again. I brought this topic up to a friend, and I was like, it just makes me so sad. And she's like, yeah, it is quite sad how the children of today are just, you know, watching their iPads, and they're not really connected to their imagination. She had no idea that I was talking about adults. And it's this thing where it's like, when you become an adult, you have to pay your rent, you have to pay your taxes, you can't be like imaginative, you can't play. And I think for me, you know, talk about these doomsday narratives, part of planning and part of the radical change that we need to make is envisioning how we want the world to be by looking at what it is now and imagining what it will be, and working backwards to create that through our planning, through our discussions, through our decisions, you know, on a local, regional, federal, provincial, whatever it is level, you know. And I think for me, I'm always trying to engage with adults in trying to be like, you can imagine, you can create things. This is an amazing resource. And I think being artists, we can continue to create pieces and works and storytelling. But I think for me, my activism is telling all the adults around me, you're just as creative as me. I've just maybe spent way more hours on it, but you're just as creative as me. So yeah, I think it maybe speaks to what you spoke to, but it did inspire me to say that. So.
No, absolutely. I just finished a book called Emergent Strategy, and one of my favorite lines in there, and one of my favorite lines was, "We are in an imagination battle." It's exactly that. It's and especially too at this time with the pandemic, it's keeping our artists imagining as well. And that's, you know, Ed, I think that's totally right to also engage everybody's imagination, because you have to be able to see a future you want before knowing how to even work towards it, right? So that's beautiful. And I do worry about the battle for imaginations greatly as well. Scary time. Hannah, I want to ask you specifically about Canary as one of them, and Ed actually wrote a blog that connected to your piece, which was a beautiful blog. And it's great because Fiona wrote a beautiful blog to Caridad's piece too. So, but yeah, I wanted to talk a bit about Canary and your access to Canary, and again, back to using poetry as a highly visual medium too, through the words, and how Canary uses uses words to show us the unknown and the unseen, which is, I mean, Canary is so powerful. And so, and with a pace that you've written in that is urgent, which is no small feat to write in urgency as well. So I wanted to ask you to speak a bit about your inspiration for Canary, the idea of bodies protecting bodies, which you spoke about in your HowlRound article, and yeah, the styles of writing and where you go to access, you know, to also embed the poetry and the urgency into all of your work, really.
Yeah, the use of imagery is something that's a really integral part of my practice. The one way in which I describe what I do is acts of radical visibility. And the idea of that is taking these things which are invisible in our culture, by which I don't just mean in a visual sense, I mean things that are silenced, things that are hidden away, often on purpose, because making something invisible is a mechanism through which we can pretend it's not there, and pretend that what we do doesn't have some sort of impact upon it. And so, you could talk about how many different types of minorities are made culturally invisible, so they can be easily oppressed. Or we could also talk about how the destruction we do to the planet is made invisible and hidden away, so we can continue as usual and pretend that it's not completely problematic and that we're not completely culpable in what's going on. So yeah, bringing things, shining a light on things, I guess, is a really important part of my practice. With Canary, it's drawn very explicitly from my own real life experience of living with rare disease, which is one of which could be classified as a climate crisis accelerated disease. And that's a particular immunologic disorder in which my white blood cells have a mutation, which I suppose a really oversimplified way of explaining it is it makes me allergic to the world. And that's quite heavily localized around, I mean, it does include a lot of really basic and natural things like food and water and sunlight and heat and cold, but it also is very heavily localized around things which are extracted from fossil fuels. And so that really means like plastic and ink and fragrance and pesticides and a lot of the things that make these up, the glycols and the phthalates. And those things are kind of, depending on the amount that I'm exposed to them, potentially fatal for me. And so because of this disease, I've actually had, I mean, a lot of people have encountered isolation through the pandemic, but I've actually been living in isolation inside a single positive pressure air sealed safe room for the last 5.5 years. And I can't even open a window without that having a potentially fatal allergic reaction to the pollutants that are in the air, essentially. So people who have the disease that I have, which is a mast cell disease, or who have similar types of diseases that cause very kind of these hypersensitive reactions to pollutants in the environment, often refer to themselves as canaries in the coal mine. And that's kind of this concept that we're like an early warning signal, or we're the people who are being impacted in a way that everyone else is being impacted, but you just see the signs of it in us first. And you could draw a similar parallel with how low-lying islands are canaries in the coal mine for other land. You know, there are certain species that have already gone extinct, or certain populations who've become climate refugees. So it's not just people who deal with climate illness that are the Canaries, but there's many types of people who are maybe made invisible and are kind of these warning signals for the rest of the planet for what's going on and what is going to happen to all of us. So I mix my own personal narrative in Canary with a kind of imagined uprising, a revolution of the coal mine Canaries, who kind of stage this fairly violent assault on the world to make what's happening to them visible and to say, you can't keep doing this to us. And I guess it's not so hopeful as some of the other narratives that people are talking about. It is leaning a little bit more towards that kind of doomsday stuff, but this is what is happening. And I think there's also room for all different sorts of narratives. Some people are motivated by statistics and data. Not a lot, some are. Some are motivated by doomsday narratives, some are motivated by hope. And I think stories are how we understand ourselves. They're what form our cultural narratives. And if all of our stories are just kind of these hyper-capitalist, neoliberal narratives, we're not going to start seeing ourselves as connected to the planet, as, well, not connected, part of the planet. We're completely indivisible. And I think that speaks very much to what Fiona was saying about the kind of false objectivity of science, that it creates this myth that humans are separate from nature or separate from the planet or separate from the climate crisis, but we're absolutely part of it. So I guess that's what my work is trying to show, as well as kind of really highlighting the inaccessibility of spaces for people like me. It's a disability access issue when we're looking at the way spaces and air are polluted, particularly with things they don't need to be polluted by, like fragrance, for example, is something that 34% of the population is really noticeably impacted by and excluded from spaces because of. So that's a huge, huge percentage. And I wanted to show how in that work, I was not able to perform that work in a space with other people because of that. But then to also look at the mechanism of what is it for us to stand up for other people who cannot. So I wanted to have another performer be a proxy for my body, in the same way that you see this happen within climate activism itself. For example, with Extinction Rebellion, there's a lot of criticism around how it's very white and middle class, or there's a lot of criticism around kind of celebrity climate activists because they can go and do these things and they'll be arrested and it's actually not that big a deal. They're not facing potential incarceration, deportation, or death because of participating in these kind of acts which implicate their bodies in a political sense. But I was really inspired by that as actually a mechanism. So how the privilege of some people allows them to do the work that is much more dangerous for other people to do, and that it is their responsibility to leverage that privilege. In the same way that in a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests, not this recent round, but I don't know if this has been happening in the recent protests, but in the earlier ones, which inspired a lot of what was happening in my piece Canary, there were many stories of white protesters there who would encircle protesters who were at higher risk. So when the police would come in to try and break up the protests, the protesters with privilege, the protection of their privilege, would encircle protesters who were Indigenous or people of colour or migrants, who, if they were arrested, would be facing very harsh penalties. They would protect them. So the protesters of privilege would be arrested instead. And yeah, I guess I really wanted to look at how, instead of placing my own body in danger for getting these messages across, how someone else could be using their privilege and their body as a conduit for what I was trying to express.
And it's it's funny because canary to me is not, it doesn't go into the category necessarily of doomsday in my head, in my thinking, because of the way it is, because of the way it's written and because of the details. And I know that a lot of people reacted so strongly to it because it's very clear what you talk about and how you put these, we absorb everything. I think it's affected people. It's definitely affected me where I don't put anything on because in terms of hair too, because it's been a while that even washing hair, putting products, I'm like, it's going into the water, like everything becomes the micro is everywhere now. And the more conscious you get, the bigger it looks. So,
yeah, I think there's absolutely a space for that kind of small scale thinking. We know that the small scale stuff is not the solution. We know the vast majority of the damage that is done is being done by a very small percentage of people, a very small percentage of corporations. And that sometimes we can be sold these kind of small scale solutions like recycling, like bringing, not using plastic bags, like not using plastic straws, as kind of a false antidote that puts all of the responsibility on the individual or the consumer and away from these major corporations who are really, that's where the change needs to be happening. The change needs to be political, it needs to be structural, it needs to be very large laws that are brought in to stop that kind of behavior happening. But there's also a lot of space for the personal because, it was brought up talking about kind of having sustainable ecological practice in the way that we make art. And a really large part of my practice was, I guess, when I became disabled, was recognizing the major cognitive dissonance that existed, the hypocrisy that existed in having this very kind of ecologically based worldview, but my relationship to my body and the way that I made art being hyper extractive, existing in these very extractivist relationships where I was working long, hard hours. I was using my body as a resource that could be mined. I was allowing myself to exhaust myself, working in these mentalities of time scarcity, valuing productivity, which is, of course, a really capitalist value, believing that, coming from these kind of very ableist and very kind of virtuosity-centered performance practices of physical theatre and dance and circus, believing I could conquer and mold my body into this perfect machine of art productivity. And I just had this, awareness when I became disabled that this is how the fossil fuel companies treat the planet. I was treating my body in the same way. This is how the kind of colonial machine treats other countries and treats other nations and populations. And that's how I was treating my body, trying to conquer it instead of working with it. And so now my ideology within my practice is to work in anti-extractivist relationship with my body and how I make art. And I think, that being able to live in that manner as an art maker, being able to live in that manner as a human and say, I'm not going to be using these products that are having this really detrimental effect on the planet to the best of my ability to not use them. Then being able to, for all the levels of yourself being complicit within sustainable practice, I think is actually an important part of changing our cultural narratives and changing the way we behave as a species.
it has to do with, I mean, this brings to the next point in terms of, you know, also, a letter from the ocean, Caridad, you're talking a lot about love, and I wanted to, you know, I wanted to speak to that too, and generosity, in terms of how do we find that generosity to share those ideas, to have patience, to have to understand more about how humanity in general is functioning, because it's very upsetting that we're going, you know, so slow. And Fiona, in your blog, you also mentioned, like, it angers you because, like, why are we not acting more quickly? Why are we so slow? So I mean, again, I'd love to hear from all of you in terms of this using art to also be generous and to also transfer love and yes, yeah, we'll see. We could possibly go beyond, because yeah, there's so great. We'll see who can, for sure. But please also jump in with things that you want to talk about as well. Please do, because Fiona, with that too, with you know, how sound, combining the regeneration and the stewardship in the community, and how you've seen the changes happening with like how much have you seen people switch and start to understand and actually move towards action, you know, combining all of these aspects. So I just threw a bunch at you guys, so please chime in, whoever would like to.
I was pointing at Fiona because I thought you ended with, well, Fiona has been, and I was like, okay, maybe she'll start before we talk about other things. Yeah, and related things.
Sure. I feel like I want to respond to many of the things that people have brought up, but yeah, just to quickly touch. So a lot of the work that I do in House Sound at Cutsum, which is this deep water fjord that's right next to the city of Vancouver. I work with communities there on documenting and bringing together their knowledge about the ocean so that we can create research and tools that can inform decision-making to protect what they care about in the face of the pressures that they see happening in this region. And that's a really important part of science, I think, is to, first of all, be answering questions that are of value to people who can then mobilize that knowledge, especially science that's in the climate change or the conservation arena. And also making sure that making sure the research is meaningful to the communities who we're working with and accessible by them. So much of the time, research is generated and then it's shipped off into peer-reviewed publications that are inaccessible, and then researchers don't actually take the responsibility for communicating their work to people outside of academia, and that's a huge problem. Like, that's a huge barrier of science. So that's a bit about my work, and it's been really incredible for me as a young marine scientist to be working in this place, because the oceans are in a really bad state right now. Don't think I have to tell the people in this call this, but that can be super depressing. And the region where I'm working, it has experienced a bit of a marine recovery, and that's led to kind of like a revival and community connection to place and community compassion and caring for these waterways, which is really wonderful for me to be in that environment. I really liked what you said, Hannah, where like people are motivated by different things. So there's people who are motivated by rage, by hope, by despair, by courage, like all sorts of, it takes all sorts of types. And I think I'm somebody who's motivated by this like recovery trajectory, because I just want to like, take us forward into a healthier state of being. I also really liked what Ed was saying about you know, being mindful of the narratives that we're telling ourselves, like that humans are, or that adults are unimaginative or uncreative. Like we need to wake up out of that. And one narrative that I see in my realm a lot is that humans are inherently self-destructive. And that's what I talked about a little bit in my blog. And that we have all of these like sci-fi stories of us destroying the earth and then going off and building our new colonies in space and whatever. That's disappointing to me because that's just sort of, it's not accurate. First of all, there are lots of examples of human societies that have lived in harmony with nature for millennia, right? Many indigenous communities, many indigenous societies have those practices that are still being employed and practiced today. So it's quite a Western, it's quite a capitalist mentality that we're just going to destroy the world around us. But it is a narrative that's quite out there in the world, and that I wish that we would break down and start telling ourselves a new way of living and a new way of being. And yeah, I have other things that I've been jotting down notes as we go, but I'll pass it on to Caridad so I don't
Yeah,
go on
thank
for too
you.
much longer.
How lovely. It makes me just think a lot about form. You know, I mean, I think one of the reasons I wrote Letter to the Ocean was I was like, what is the ocean thinking? I wanted to hear from the ocean desperately. And I guess in that provocation is the idea that decentering the human as the character, you know, at the front of a story, but that actually land or water or a plant can be at the center of the story, and that maybe we need to start listening, and also that the form of the work not mimic capitalist time in its consciousness, so that the art form itself is I'm going to use the word modeling. I don't think it's quite right because I think that can be a little bit dangerous in the sense that, you know, it becomes a brand. You know, you model this and then everything looks the same. You know, that's not what I mean at all. But I mean that the work that you make can, in its shape, um, affect how people view the world, right? So I think that art making is a way of seeing, as we know. It's also a disruption. And that disruption is around, well, certain stories are told the same way all the time. Well, let's turn the tables on that and reorder the universe a little bit, even if it's just on stage, even if it's just on video, even if it's whatever your medium is. And maybe an audience will be like, oh, I could, it could be possible to think differently about time, about consciousness, about like our relationship to the planet, even through the mode that you make the work in. So I felt like, you know, to me that's become more and more important. I think that, you know, my earliest work sort of had themes of what people call environmentalism, uh, you know, in it. And then my awareness just sort of grew that was actually one of my central subjects as an art maker. And that's become more urgent because, you know, the crisis has become more urgent. And I think where my anger, my art rage, outside of, you know, all those many small minority, powerful minority of folks extracting and depleting resources, has to do with the anger has to do with even within our own quote theater industry, a lack of sometimes I think a lack of imagination around other ways of making and doing things. And actually, what I'm encountering right now, because we're in this unique place of, you know, live venues, you know, can't happen and all this thing, or they can happen in a very minimal way, especially in the US, is that I see, you know, I see some people doing amazing work, and I also see some people just kind of waiting. They're saying, well, we'll just wait and then things will go back to normal. And it's like, but wait a minute, don't you understand? Like there is no normal. And that normal, whatever that normal was very broken to begin with. So it's this fight, I think, this battle to move forward. But that move forward is not about, I'm going to use the word progress, which is not the one I want, but not a kind of an acceleration of productivity, but more around an entire recalibration and rebuilding of the industry itself, on every level, including the work till you drop mentality that is particularly pernicious in our industry, and one that affects people studying and training in the arts as much as people who are trying to make a living trying to make a living in the precarity of the arts. So that's something I'm just really interested in, and ways of pushing at the boundaries of that, and trying to be in conversation with audiences rather than telling them what to think. So that's one of my goals, and touching on stuff, but I also want to give people room, so I will shut up.
Well, in how the piece ended up in the festival, Caridad, a lot of the way the image was used was bringing a lot to me about what is our role as humans in this moment. And I'm always so, I get excited when things are slowed down, because everything in the world is so fast, and I'm someone who's non-neurotypical, so I walk out and I just feel like I'm a raw nerve, just being like, whoa, why is everything, like, and so I spend a lot of time in the forest, with the ocean, where things are just slower. And I always think, as an artist, I have to be this hybrid creature that's like, almost like an amphibian, but for a city and nature. So I have to be in the city sometimes and then just go and like peace out and just like, recalibrate. But what I was noticing about the performer and the materials that they were working with, and then the image arriving, some of the shots, specifically toward the end, there was so much material on top of the table, and you could see that this person was creating it. And it really just made me think about how we are creating this world, and how we've created this thing that we're witnessing and facing and experiencing and living through. And it just hit me quite strongly, that image, because you could see the projection, you could see the other light in the back, and then you could see that this person was molding and creating this universe, this image that we were seeing. And it really struck me how, one of the questions we had was, is it easy to make film or easy to make theater now, or whatever it is. But one of the things that strikes me about ever recording visually something is that you can edit things, or you can have a really long shot, and you can really be specific about what's in the frame. And that was one of the moments where I was like, this really works, because I'm seeing like the full extent of creating, and then what is the product, what arrives. And so that was really cool to see that it being done that way. And in the second piece in the festival as well, I think they was able to edit the two performers to have their faces next to each other. And that's something we can do with film. We can edit things to, like, you can show the sea level being a drop of water, and then all of a sudden you can show the deluge. Whereas in live theater, it's not always, that possible. And it's also not, eco-friendly to be doing that. But yeah, just speaking to that, it was cool to see that happening in your piece.
That's great. It's all the conversation of traveling versus, now that we're in this state of having to also like use the medium of video, to pieces can travel and speak to more people, whereas theater is very local, which is also beautiful. It is live, we love it, we do it, and but it's very interesting to think about how work travels, but also how energy travels, how thoughts travel, how, I mean, that's a purpose, right? Is we live in that imagination, that thinking of how do we, just how do we support progressive thought through our work, through our words, through our poetry. I'd love to give you guys the time to also go back on some of the things you picked up on that you haven't had a chance to say, please. Better than my questions. So.
Yeah, I'll just do a quick, just piggybacking off of what you said, Christina, which is this notion of travel and how the work travels. One of the things I love about it, despite, I think we all do, the despair around live venues, not being able to function. It's an ancient form. It will come back. But one of the things I love about it right now, and I hope this will continue in the future, is that it decenters those sort of cosmopolitan capital places for art. So, London, New York, Chicago, where people think that's the only place where art happens. Because the media sort of promotes that idea. And one of the beautiful things that's been happening in the last year is that, suddenly you're seeing local work from a community that you never would have had access to. And the audience is from all over. And that decentering, just that simple fact alone of starting to really crack open and decenter that narrative that, you have to be in that city center, the 5 city centers of the world in order to make art, is, I think, a win. You know what I mean? I think that that's a huge thing to happen in our industry. And I hope that it doesn't go away, that it completely decenters itself. That's my hope.
Well, I mean, even in literature around sustainable development, decentralizing is to our benefit, because who really knows exactly what to do? And if you do, I think you're probably an idiot, because we don't know exactly what to do. We don't know exactly what to do. We're all just collaborating, trying to figure this out. And I think decentralizing, in the literature, it speaks a lot about our politics, and doing that as well in our politics and the way we govern and the decision making, and knowing for ourselves which level the decisions are being made, so we can vote according to where the decision's being made in order to create this change. And if we can decentralize it, then people who think they know are not the only people who are making the decision for us, but actually we are activated and we can make those decisions on the multi-levels, and knowing, in this hierarchy that we live in, at the top, knowing where our influence is in that, and I think decentralizing is an important thing about that, because if it is all centralized, then, I mean, honestly, don't even want to talk about that. But you also had mentioned, Carrie, that it's an ancient form and it will come back in some way. Approaching this conversation, I was thinking about that a lot. For me, part of the reason why I'm still in theater is when I walked into the theater and started working in theater, is like, it felt like home. It felt like a heart space that I could enter. And even every time I go into, especially an old theater, it's like that feeling of, it's been around for so long, and it's so old, and there's like all this energy, this heart, and it's so weird and curious, and everything's so ancient. And it reminds me so much of, it's an ancient practice. It's been going on forever. And it is so resilient. There's like, we are people who, improvisation is in theater, and we know how to improvise. So we're improvising right now. We might have to improvise for a long time still. And it's just going to be to our benefit. And I'm thinking a lot about the resiliency of theater, and not, I have my own despair about not being able to commune with people and be with my theater peeps or whatever. But I'm also always trying to think of the opportunity to grow and strengthen in these type of moments, which kind of brings me to, and this is my own agenda that I'm bringing into this conversation, but I'd mentioned earlier about the sacred aspect that Indigenous sustainability sciences speaks to, and that's something that's really important to me, and I've almost been in the closet about it my whole life. I've almost been like, oh, spirituality, like, never mind, because there's so many different points of view in the world, and you never really, that whole saying about don't bring up religion at a party or whatever it is. But I've deepened my spiritual practice in the last year or so. But inside of that, it has taught me a lot about turning adversity into opportunity. There's so much opportunity for an adversity to make you feel completely helpless, completely useless, completely devoid of any choice. And I was so moved just to hear you talk about your story, Hannah. And I had the great honor of writing my blog about your piece, and honestly, it just moved me so much to read it, and then to watch it and to hear you talk about it. And the strength of character that you emit just by being here telling your story. And I in no way want to be like, I don't know, exploiting that, but I think we had spoken early in this conversation about the emotions of this whole thing, and being connected, and not just objective about things. And I really wanted to ask you, if you are willing to share, and if you're able to, how you were able to, it's been 5.5 years, I think you said, like that moment at that point, like, I can only imagine with someone who's got a human sentience, what that might have been like. I do not know. And then living how you live now, I'm just curious about where your strength comes from, and how, I need to go to the sea every day, or I need to go and touch a tree. And I'm curious about how you're navigating things like that in terms of your spiritual health, your mental health, and if spirituality is even a thing in your lexicon, or how you go about that type of thing.
Thanks for the invitation to talk about that. It's actually something that has been evolving over the time that I've been living in this space. And to begin with, all I was experiencing was the sickness. And I thought that I would never be able to make art again, because I only knew how to make using lots of energy, lots of stress very quickly, using deadlines as the thing that fueled me. And it took many years to realize there were different ways of making, using different time processes. So I draw a lot of wisdom from the disability community in using crip time, which is things take as long as they take. And it's a very conscious lean into deceleration and unpredictability, and going past deadlines, and these kind of soft barriers to time, and connecting with the disability community and crip activism was kind of what gave me, I guess, a lot of need to start connecting and communicating with people, and a lot of sense of community and a need for justice within that community. But more recently, that's actually shifted to a much more kind of spiritual connection. And I've been really thankful for how the practices that I'm tapping into now have allowed me to actually quite literally bring the nature back into this space that I'm in. And, we talk about drawing wisdom from different places, and I talked about the wisdom of the disability culture and how that's a source of wisdom, but I've also been recognizing that to connect with the planet, it's not just the planet symbolically as this big global thing, but it's also the kind of more medium scale local connection. And I realized I needed to be connecting with the land that I'm on, the country, the unceded country that I'm on, but I also need to be connecting with my ancestry and the land that I'm from. And that led me to a very deep reconnection with my Sami ancestry, and connecting with people from the Sami community and connecting with the Sami cultural practices that bring a very, in an ancient sense, a very animist relationship with the earth, which is, it also feels like an antidote away from these kind of capitalist narratives. In capitalism and in extractivist culture, we, for lack of a better word, dehumanize. Human's not the right word for it, but we dehumanize things. We turn rocks and the planet into inanimate things because then we can mine it. We turn plants into the same, then we can exploit them, we can grow them in industrial scale wherever we want, the same with animals, and the same with other people. The way that colonial culture has dehumanized certain populations so we can exploit them, particularly through the history of slavery. And it feels like de-anthropocentrizing our narratives, you know, taking the human out of the center of the narrative and kind of bringing those animist perspectives back is an antidote to that kind of exploitative tool to say, you know, yeah, the nature is alive, all these other things are as alive as we are. And so being able to connect to that and being able to connect to that very much from a Sami viewpoint has just allowed me to reconnect spiritually and to find that kind of not only a spiritual connection to the earth and a spiritual connection to ancestry and community, but a spiritual strength, for lack of a better word, in going through what I live with, but going through what we're all going through all at once in the experience of the planet right now. And yeah, I don't want to lean too heavily into the idea of strength. That's another narrative that I like to lean away from. I like to think about the idea that weakness can be valuable as well. And there's a quote that I use in a different artwork of mine called The Mermaid, which is very much about kind of immunologic vulnerability and using my body as a metaphor for the planet. And there's a trans activist that I quote, who at the end of the quote mentions that it's through vulnerability that the revolution operates. And that's through, you know, it's asking people to be weak and be hopeless so we can try and actually discover a completely new way of being, instead of fighting, being strong, these kinds of like really battle language mentalities. But that's not to say that we don't fight, you know, we do. We fight with our softness and we fight with our love and we fight with our connection. I guess it's just a different way of thinking about strength and fighting.
Yeah, the word strong and strength always reminds me of when I was a child, and if something very bad happened, and everybody was visibly upset about it, and I was like sort of like stoic, like I would be called strong, and it just made me so pissed off that and then inevitably in my life I would be told, you know, difficult things, you know, emotional things, like someone had died or someone was in an accident or something, and then I would be told that I could handle it because I'm a strong girl. And you know, that type of thing is almost haunts me, I think. And I'm glad that you brought that up about the word strong, because my vulnerability and my ability to soften is so important to me and so important to my community. People talk about, my feedback often is about the softness and the vulnerability and how it can open things. And you speaking about that in your experience and in our global experience just is a really beautiful reminder about that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? We have a few minutes left. Anybody else burning to?
I guess.
Yes, go ahead, please.
This was something that was mentioned a little ways ago, but I think just connecting back to climate change solutions and kind of the scale at which they happen. There is no one, solution to climate change because it is so multifaceted. And it is interesting to have conversations about like how individual changes or individual behavioral change compares to the bigger scale political or corporate change making. And of course, that has like a huge, intense, big impact. And they've convinced a lot of people that, the individuals are where the change has to happen rather than them, and try to shift the responsibility. So yeah, I just thought I'd bring that point back up, just like the behavioral change has to happen to get people to care. We're not going to bring about global change if people just don't care about the earth or don't care about the water or the life other than humans. And that is where I see behavioral change being really important, is just like learn to love something other than your individual self or like our human species, because there's so much more in this world. And then figure out what systems you can tackle and you can take on to shift and transform into a better place and a more sustainable way of operating. Yeah. And I really liked Ed's point about the like local scale of movements and just kind of that like community base. That's for me, as somebody who gets overwhelmed and anxious about climate change, like that's how I ground myself, is just kind of connecting back to the place that I grew up and the people who I'm working with. And that is so important to have that, like, yeah, I guess kind of like going out into the forest or whatnot, just having that connection. I think grassroots movements are a really effective way to cope with the idea of climate change, but do so in a way that's sustainable and that's not going to overwhelm or, yeah.
Yeah, and on the point of love, it's like the minute you start, I actually think humans do have difficulty loving themselves. I think that's part of the big problem too. And I think that when you do open up to love of all species, it helps heal the human very quickly, actually. So yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for all of your amazing minds and thoughts and imaginations, and please always remain the keepers of the imaginations as we move forward. We need all of you immensely to keep on this incredible work you're all doing. It's been such a privilege to have you all on this talkback, and I feel very grateful, and thank you so much for being here. And anyone like a final word?
I want to shout out actually a theater organization, or I guess a performance and arts organization in so-called Vancouver that does amazing work for sustainability and eco-consciousness in our communities here. And they're probably gonna be like, you silly, why are you doing that? But it's called Vines Art Festival, and it happens in August in numerous parks and outside areas. It's completely free, and it happens in August here in so-called Vancouver. And it's one of the festivals that, every marginalized group of artists, we know that we can go and knock on that door and create pieces that are related to our ecosystems, our ecology, our ancestors, our lived experiences, our diasporas, all of these things. And it's a free festival and it's outdoors, and they just do such incredible work. And I think, everybody in this call should go and look at them. And whoever this reaches, look up Vines Art Festival, seriously.
Thank you. Thank you. And please look into all of these wonderful artists' work as well. We're going to link a bunch of things to the video too, that'll link people to all the great work that you're all doing. So just Thank you, thank you, thank you. Many thanks, much love, and until the next time.